Greetings! Welcome to our next part of Discovering the Word. We're going to be popping right into Scripture, getting right into Genesis 1. We're starting at Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And today we're going to particularly focus on those words, in the beginning. In Hebrew, one word, bereshith, in the beginning. So, what's the first thing that you think about when you hear in the beginning? It's a new beginning. There's a new story coming into place, a new timeline, if you will. And for Orthodox Christians, and we'll be exploring that more as we go through Genesis 1, for Orthodox Christians, this is a marker of the very beginning of all matter, and matter being created things. So there's two things in existence: God, who is existence himself, and created matter, which is separate, distinct from God. And this marks the beginning of those things, of all things. This is very suggestive then. God is eternal. That means there's no time in God. We have a beginning. We have an end. Not so much that we will not, because of the way God has created us, we're not going to wink out of existence. But we can mark the time which we've lived. That doesn't exist for God. And that suggests that time is created here as well. And it's not simply a creation. It's not like God created this thing called time. No, it's more that time is created alongside creation. We might call time an aspect of God's creation of the universe. So we experience creation as time. I think this is even true in science. We have Einstein's theory of relativity, where he taught that time is attached to matter. It's an aspect of matter. The space-time continuum is what he called it. So we have this sense that as soon as matter comes into existence, time comes into existence, and we experience matter ourselves as time. Now this raises a question about God. This is some of the mystery of who God is. One of the things that is central to Scripture, central to the teaching of the Scripture, is who man is and who God is. We've already explored a bit who man is. Man has a beginning. We see that in this first verse of Scripture, but it also says something about God. God is the creator. There are two truths about God that we need to put this in context, in the context of. We're taught in Scripture that God is immutable. That means that God doesn't change. We're also taught in Scripture that God is free. God wasn't forced to create. God freely chose to create. This creates a bit of bit of a conundrum for understanding how God created. Is there a separation of God and creation? Is there a separation from God and his title as creator? Wouldn't that create a division in God and also suggest a change in God when he came, when he actually created? Isn't there now potential in God? And part of the way we have to get around this is to say simply that God is beyond time. There is no before or after with God. So God eternally creates, and he also freely creates. This whole example of how it's so hard to hold together the attributes of God. The freedom of God on the one hand, and the mutability of God on the other hand, and what is taught in his word that he creates. All these things force us to realize the limits of our language in talking about God. And this brings me to another thing that is taught in Christian doctrine about talking about God, and how it's helpful for understanding the limits of our understanding. So there are two ways of talking about something. We can speak of something univocally or analogically. So the first word, univocally. Univocally means that when I say something, when I talk about a shelf and my friend talks about a shelf, we're basically talking about the same thing. Analogically, what would be a good example of analogy? It's a bit hard to come up with a real good example from human to human. Even in the shelf example, there's a bit of, yes, univocal, but also analogical, right? I might be thinking of a certain type of shelf, and when I say shelf to my friend, he might be thinking of another type of shelf. I might be thinking of a freestanding shelf, for example, and he might be thinking of one that you screw into the wall. And that's a slight example of analogy. We can also think of a phrase like the trees of the hills clap their hands. We're not speaking of the trees literally clapping hands or having hands, right? And some friend who doesn't understand metaphor might hear that and think of that in a totally different way. I'm just using a picture of something, a picture of the joy that is out there in nature. And partly because this all connects to the fact that we're all human, we're all created in the image of God. There's going to be a degree of univocity in when we talk to each other. Now, when we talk about God is at once, there is a degree of univocity in talking about God. When we say one person loves another person, and when we say God is love, there's some relationship between those two things. But in another sense, it's completely different and beyond our ability to comprehend in God himself. we can think of it in terms, perhaps in terms of a child compared to us, right? A child has only a vague understanding of the adult world, and we need to and we times that by 1,000,000. We only have a vague understanding of the almightiness, the immutability, the freedom of God. He is far beyond us. The transcendence of God is another term that theologians use. So when we say God is immutable, that he doesn't change, we're not saying that we can completely understand that. When we say that God is free, and yet he, in an unchanging way, has decided to create from eternity. Again, we're using analogical language. We want to be really careful about how we speak of God so that we don't turn God into a man on the one hand, and that we don't make God inaccessible on the other hand. So that term analogy helps us because it says, yes, we're saying something true about God when we're saying he doesn't change. When we're saying he freely chose to create, even though that choice is from eternity. That, from our perspective, there was a time when creation was not. We don't understand fully how that works from God's perspective, because he's far beyond our imaginations. And I hope that this talk has given you how even those first three words of Scripture can give us so much reflection about who we are and who God is and what he's doing in the Bible, in revealing himself to us in this way. Thank you for joining us for our second part of the Discovering the Word series, and I hope to see you next time for part 3. Thanks. Bye.